Just the other day, I did a full Linux system upgrade. I wanted to upgrade my drivers. It had been a while. I was having some issues with a bit of OpenGL, I think, and I was like, all right, it's been a while since I updated it. Maybe it's something to do with that. And so I did do that. Then when it came to restarting, it was just a black screen. That was it. And it was quite frustrating, as you can imagine. It took me like the whole day, and then even when I could get into like the command line, I had no internet. I was just missing so much things. But it turns out the issue was Grub was using the wrong Linux kernel, and so it just all the packages weren't there because it was on the newer one. But this did get me thinking of what is the best Linux operating system to go on when you're looking at developing commercial games or commercial software, as maybe a more stable operating system is the preferred approach, as I am running on Arch Linux, which is not really considered as stable. As you, when you do an upgrade, it pretty much upgrades to whatever the latest packages is released, as opposed to alternatives like Ubuntu, which have quite a strict release cycle. You have the major release, then you have obviously security patches within. And within each major one, they ensure or hope to ensure that they are going to be as stable as possible and work on many machines. A good place to start to find our most stable operating system would be the Steam hardware survey and find out what is the most popular Linux operating system. And obviously, the Steam hardware survey is one of the best data you can get, because if you're playing games on PC, there's like a 99% chance you are playing on and using Steam through it, so it's going to be very accurate. And we can scroll down to the OS version, and we can find that obviously Windows is going to be the most predominantly popular operating system at a very impressive 96% above. But Linux takes up a humble 2.06% as of January this month, and change between 3 to 2% generally. And we can actually see that Arch Linux is the most popular single operating system within the Linux area, at taking up a nice 0.19%. But if we were to sort it by Debian operating systems, then we'd find that they would be more popular. So that includes Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and Ubuntu Core. They are Debian-based operating systems. And we can actually see that the rest of the operating systems that are available are actually Debian-based ones, so the bookworm, the Linux 12. Another note is Manjaro Linux is also Arch-based, so they are close to being neck and neck, but Debian just takes out by a slight point percentage. But overall, you think that's actually really not much. Like a point percentage, is that a big difference, as opposed to something like Windows 11 and between Windows 10, actually quite a significant gap between them, about 10% nowadays. And obviously Windows 7 takes up nothing. That's like it's an unsupported operating system anymore, but people still do play on it. I'm not even sure if Steam actively updates for it. I know for some Mac versions now, quite older, no longer support it, so you see those ones fizzle away. Another good question is, why even develop on Linux if Windows is the most popular operating system? Humongous 96% and above, while also they offer a Proton which lets Linux users run Windows games. For me personally, it's just I prefer programming and developing on Linux. It's just the experiences seems to make more sense. I want to say, like, more grounded. Like when you're installing software, you install it through the terminal and you run and build them through the terminal. So I can build this application through there rather than using a software to then build it. Like you create a file with something like CMake and then you run the CMake or so on, and you can give it parameters. So it just kind of makes sense to me to do it on Linux. Okay, what is the next thing? Well, what engine are you looking to make it on? What is your game going to be? Well, there's a few options we have. We obviously have Unity that does run, in fact, on Linux. It can be installed the same way. As you notice, requires a few extra changes. It's not as easy as it probably would be on Windows. Another one is Unreal Engine as well, that can install on Linux as well. It used to be that you had to build this from scratch. You had to go on GitHub and download the code and then build it yourself, and that would take a long time. You couldn't have the software like the installer like you do now. I think, as it appears to be, you can now. It does say that you can just download a pre-built version, thankfully. There are others like more lower level, like STL3, which is like almost the lowest you can go, unless you want to build the whole render yourself, or something a bit more simple like Raylib, which is a classic. That's the one I like to use. A good rule of thumb is to develop on something that is cross-platform like Raylib. This runs on all operating systems and also works on multiple programming languages of your choice, really. So that's also that advantage. If you want something a bit more high level as well, and that's also cross-platform, then Godot is obviously a great choice. This works fantastic on Linux. You can actually just download it on through Steam as well, so you can just do that, and it works out the box. It uses either OpenGL or Vulkan, which are again cross-platform and they're open source. Unlike things like Unreal and Unity, which I think can utilize both DirectX and Vulkan, which is obviously why it runs able to run on Linux. But I think with those, you can't really guarantee if whatever you're making will run exactly the same on Windows. These are operating system, well, engines, I should say, that are more designed for the Windows. They are more oriented for it. It's pretty rare to see an Unreal or Unity game run natively on Linux. Most of the time it's just being done through Proton because that's the easiest. It requires quite a bit more effort to compile them to run natively on Linux. You'd have to ensure that they run fine as well. Stuff like Unreal, they have the latest features that may not work on Linux. So there's like stuff like the DLSS, stuff that in theory works on Linux because they obviously NVIDIA graphics cards do work, but they aren't using the same drivers. The obviously Linux drivers are going to be different, and trying to accommodate that is significantly more different for a developer. If you're someone who wants to develop on Unreal or is very knowledgeable in Unreal, I'd probably just stick to being Windows. Same goes for Unity. I just think their experiences, that they built these engines that are far more designed for Windows, and the experience on them is going to be much more pleasant on Windows. I always feel like if you're on Linux, then just use what's really great on Linux. Stuff like SDL3, Raylib, and Godot, they're great on Linux. They work superb, so there's no issue there. Why go through the pain of doing all that on those engines? Just go on Windows. Except that's what it's going to be like. Despite all that, you're still going to need a Windows operating system to test those games on, even if you are using Godot and Raylib, stuff like that across platform. You just got to ensure that they do work fine. You don't want to be missing out on 96% of the player base when you're selling a piece of software or game. That's a huge amount of revenue missed. Probably one more thing I should mention is this: if you want to develop on VR headsets, we can see that there is a fair few people that do have a VR headset, being the Quest 2 is the most popular. But if you want to work on them, I'd probably recommend doing it on Windows. Oculus and all these other VR headsets which have their own proprietary software, so developing on them on Linux is perhaps impossible or really difficult. The only native VR headset that I can think of is Valve's own VR headset, the Index, which is also getting quite old now, and was an expensive piece of hardware that you had to have directly plugged into your PC. And even when they released Half-Life Alyx, I'm pretty confident that launched exclusively on Windows. I think it runs on Linux now natively, but even then they weren't developing their own game for the Linux operating system, probably because it's like even less than 2% when we think about it. That's just something worth thinking about as well. So to conclude, firstly, use what you're comfortable with. You don't have to choose what I recommend, but I would say use a stable operating system like a Debian based one like Linux Mint, where they have these annual releases that have the major changes in, while the rest, like between each version, they just have like security updates and are slower to release updates. You might have the latest features, but you're far more likely to have ones that are stable. And to also use game engines or game dev tools that run cross-platform, like your Raylib or your Godot, or even lower level SDL3. And it's interesting as I do this video, when we talk about operations, as there was a delay in a release for Ubuntu 24.04, and that was because it seems that the latest images are missing some beneficial for more recent hardware, so they've pushed the updates back. Sort of making sure what they release is ready and available, and it benefits as many people as possible, which is nice. Unlike Arch Linux, which is they just kind of, here's the latest updates that you can download, and they should work, but they can't guarantee it on everything because it's just the latest, right? So that's that. Another small thing is just with graphics cards, AMD tends to run much more better, like out of the box, as in you install it, it works. And some people claim or have slightly better performance on AMD, and that's because AMD drivers are open source. Unlike NVIDIA, they have got an open source one, but there's still a closed source one. It's kind of a new thing, and there tends to be issues with drivers. Like with Arch Linux, you can install like 5 different driver versions, like NVIDIA long-term service, NVIDIA normal one, and there's NVIDIA DKMS, and then there's NVIDIA Open, which is the open source one. It's like, there's a lot to choose from. Unlike AMD, you just install the AMD GPU and it works fine. Anyway, Comment down below what you think. If you're a Linux user of a long time, or you're someone who's thinking of just moving, tell me your experience of it, whether you want to stick to it, or you're thinking of moving back to Windows, or your Windows moving to Linux. Tell me down below. And I'll see you in any future videos. Bye.